All right, so welcome to our fifth session of political ideologies. So today we're going to be going over the readings on communism and socialism. As you can see, I have a PowerPoint for the Marx reading. So as I mentioned, since we won't have any session tomorrow because of the 4th of July, I'm also going to cover the other readings today as well. So we have the Trotsky, Mao, and Sanders readings as well. So we're going to cover all those in one session. They sort of build off of one another, or you can see how they relate, how they compare to one another. So I think it'll be good to cover each of those in this one session today. So because of that, we probably won't spend as much time on each individual one, but I'll try to give you at least a taste or an understanding for each reading for the discussion board for this week. All right, so remember, you have a discussion board this week on these topics. Once again, same timeline, so due Saturday by midnight, then your classmate response Monday by midnight. I haven't gotten to grading the last discussion board yet, but I'm hoping to wrap that up either tonight or tomorrow. All right, so that you can have those grades in before the next one is due. All right, if you have questions, feel free to type in the chat box as we go, or of course you can email me if you're watching this later on as well. All right, so getting into the first reading, so I want to get into the Marx and Engels reading, the Communist Manifesto. So, of course, I'm sure it's a reading that you're all familiar with. Many of you probably have not read it yet, but it's good that you are reading it for this class because it is really one of the most influential texts in political science, in world history, in recent times, of course. So let's dive into the Communist Manifesto. As you'll notice, it's not an extremely long reading. So, of course, you have the electronic version, but the printed version is only like 60, 70 pages. So, small pages. So it's not a very difficult work to get through. But what I want to do today is highlight some of the main points, all right, of what Marx and Engels are talking about here and how they foresee a communist system operating, why they're arguing for it. It's important to remember that at the time this was written, it was written by communist activists who were pushing for a communist movement within the United Kingdom. So Marx and Engels both lived in London, and think about the time period where they're writing this. So they're writing this during the Industrial Revolution, all right? So they're seeing how workers are being exploited, the terrible conditions that people are working under, and that's why they're coming up with these arguments that they are for this new system, all right? The first line that you see within the Communist Manifesto is here in the slide, which is, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." All right. So it's important to remember that this is really a writing that came about by communist activists at that time, and it was pushing for that movement within the country. All right. And they were pushing for a revolution. So one thing you'll note here about Marx and Engels is really when they're pushing for this communist revolution, they're pushing for this not to be any half-assed sort of movement. They want to go all the way toward this utopian vision that they have. All right. And one thing you'll see with these different readings that we're going to go through is that Marx and Engels, and you'll see this in the difference between communism and socialism, is that Marx and Engels were firmly communist. And they disdained socialists. They thought that socialists were people who compromised too much with the current system. And that's something you really have to get out of this text, all right? So a little bit more background that we have on the slide here. So the Communist Manifesto came about through a meeting of communists in London, and they wrote this manifesto to make their views public, all right? And their aims and their tendencies for the movement. So it really begins to address this issue of class antagonism, because according to Marx and Marxism generally, all of world history is guided by economics. Economics is the force behind everything, all right? And class is what we should worry about here. And of course, there are two classes. There's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, okay? And we'll get into how Marx writes about those classes relating to one another. Another quote here from Marx that you'll see on the slide is that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. So the way that all society is ordered according to Marx is all through class, the haves and the have-nots, right? And that all of world history is defined by those struggles between the haves and the have-nots, regardless of borders, regardless of anything else. That is the most important guide in world history, all right? And what Marx says is that history shows us that the oppressor and the oppressed are in a constant opposition to each other. So there's this constant conflict, all right? And sometimes that's hidden, sometimes that's open. But every time the fight ends in either a revolutionary construction of society or in the class's common ruin. All right, so that's really what Marx is getting at here. And he's arguing that the proletariat needs to rise up, needs to spur on that revolution so that they can have a better future than the conditions where they're currently living. All right. All right, moving on to the next slide. So if you look at the structure of the Communist Manifesto, it starts out by having the statement of purpose, all right, and how Marx and Engels are going to push their views, their aims, their ideas for communism moving forward. And it's a document that's meant to be read by the general public. One thing you'll notice within the Communist Manifesto is that the language is not necessarily very complex. I mean, it's written fairly simple, so that it can be grasped by a large audience, all right, because they're trying to appeal to widen the movement. And this is one of the reasons why it's been such an influential text. It's not something that's only accessible to top academics. It's accessible to your general person on the street. Your average person can read the Communist Manifesto. All you need is basic literary skills and you can read that text. And that's the way that it was written. I mean, one thing you'll notice too with people running for public office, oftentimes they need to speak in a language that normal people can understand, right? If you're coming up with these very complex ideas, these abstract thoughts, you use these words that people don't use in their everyday lives, you probably aren't going to win your election. You're not going to build your movement. That was one of the reasons why the Communist Manifesto was written the way that it was. So pay attention to that. Pay attention to the language, the way things are written, and who their target audience is. So that's a reason why it's not a particularly long text, and it's written in this simple language, all right? And it's meant to be a general overview or a platform for the communist movement. Okay. All right, so some of the main ideas that Marx and Engels introduce within the text. So they introduce a lot of key ideas within the theory here. So the first and most major one is that all of history up until now is dictated by economics and class struggles. All right. If you take anything away from Marx, the Communist Manifesto, that's probably the most important thing, is that all of history is guided by economics and class struggle. So every society in history has a characteristic economic structure which breeds these different classes, okay? But Marx says that this is not permanent, that it can't last. It's an unsustainable system. So eventually that means of production ceases to be compatible with the current class structure because somebody is exploiting somebody else. Those who are being exploited are unhappy and they have to want to change the system, okay? So eventually that system and that struggle begins to impede the development of society and its productive forces. So that existing structure will need to be destroyed. And that is why Marx is calling for a revolution. And Marx himself even explicitly states that's going to be a violent revolution because those who are the oppressors are not going to be happy with that change. All right. So Marx is not somebody who's averse to having a violent overthrow. And one of the things we've seen in communist revolutions throughout history is that they oftentimes are very violent. All right. Going on with that. So this is what, to Marx, the next bullet point here in the slide is that this explains the emergence of the bourgeoisie out of feudalism. So if we look at European society, remember he's writing this in London, right? We had the feudalist system in the Middle Ages. Eventually, that system changed to having a more industrialized system. Marx is saying eventually that's going to change as well. All right. And that is something that is going to lead to the destruction of the bourgeoisie, so of that oppressive class. So Marx feels that all of history should be understood in this way, of the oppressed and the oppressors. And that it's a process of realigning society in a way that is more sustainable in the long term. And he's writing what his vision is for that more sustainable society. All right. So I mentioned the things that Marx does see as important, and that is, of course, economics and class, right? It's also important to draw out what things Marx sees as being unimportant. So there are some topics that Marx doesn't pay as much attention to, things like religion, culture, ideology, and individual human beings. They play very little role in Marx's ideology, all right? So remember, he's focused on class. He's focused on economics. These other things are not so much of a concern to him. All right. You don't really see them addressed within the Communist Manifesto. He's not really saying much of anything about these sorts of other things that most people would deem important outside of Marxist theory. And that's been one of the biggest criticisms of Marx, is that he doesn't pay enough attention to things like religion, which does play a major role in many parts of the world. Okay. The last point here, history from Marx moves according to impersonal forces. Its overall direction is inevitable. So again, he's focused on class. It's not anything personal. It's focused on the structure of society that's defined by economics and the system that's in place. All right. Okay. But once again, Marx feels that this kind of history will eventually come to an end. So what the manifesto is arguing is that this modern class conflict that they see within the industrial age is the final class conflict. And that's going to bring about the end of class relations. And that's what Marx sees as being the more sustainable society, by doing away with classes completely. All right. And here are some of the ways that Marx, in which this modern era is unique. All right. So in the time that he's writing this, classes for him have been simplified. You have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. There are only two classes. All right. So the Industrial Revolution for him is actually a simpler time, in that there are two classes. And everything is seen in terms of self-interest. And the last point is that the bourgeoisie continually revolutionized the instruments of production, which leaves social relations in an unstable state. And he argues that the ingredients are there for a revolution. Okay, so reading the text, one of the things that you see that's extremely evident is Marx really pounds in this idea of the plight of the modern laborer. All right, if you read any communist propaganda, any sort of things from that time, that is what you really see as being focused on, is the worker, right? I mean, think about how these parties were named, right? They're oftentimes named the Workers' Party. On the Soviet flag, they have the hammer and sickle, right? Symbols of the workers. And he feels that in the society that he's living in his time, in the industrial age, that the worker is commodified. A worker is simply a part of machinery. They're not viewed as human beings. So the worker only matters insofar as he produces and doesn't have control over his production. And what he sees is that those who are non-producers, so the bourgeoisie, are the ones who are benefiting from this system. And he's saying that the laborers are not going to take it anymore. All right. So the story of the laborer to Marx is a story of obvious exploitation, and has had great resonance with many of Marx's readers, of course. And this is why Marx's writings spread and became such a major influence throughout world history. Okay. Some of the things that Marx gets into here. So Marx also shows that the proletariat are a unique class for obvious reasons. He sees them as being the productive class, right? They're also the majority of society, and their numbers continue to grow. He also says they virtually have nothing to lose. The lives that they're living at this point are unfulfilling. They're seen as machinery. What do they have to lose by revolting against this system where they're being exploited? All right. So they have no power or privileges that they have to defend. They have nothing to lose. They're already in such a poor position, it couldn't get any worse for the workers, according to Marx. So because of that, and because they're not benefiting, they have to destroy the entire system. The status quo is not an option for the worker, according to Marx. And there's no change that will satisfy him other than utter destruction of that system. All right. Well, it's important to remember how these ideas may seem extreme, but of course they have been put into practice. The next point is that when that revolution occurs, once the proletariat revolts, they must destroy the entire system of class exploitation, including all private property. Because the workers, according to Marx, don't really have anything, right? The factory owners are the ones who own everything, right? The workers don't really have anything. They don't own the means of production. Because of that, private property should be destroyed, and it should be distributed among everybody who, in Marx's view, everyone will become a productive citizen once the communist revolution occurs. All right. And this is what Marx describes as being the last part of history, is that once the communist revolution takes place, there won't be a need for another revolution because society will be in this utopian state where everybody is equal. You won't have this division of classes anymore. Everybody will be in one class. All right. And he says that this stage can only exist due in part to the existence of the other stages. So what Marx is arguing is that it's a natural progression of history. All right. And that it's the proletariat who must create the revolution. Nobody else can do it. All right. So the people are the ones who have to stand up. All right. So we mentioned about how Marx sort of puts aside ideas of religion, ideology, these sorts of things, and he moves those ideas in being rooted in people's material existence, right? And he says that most of these ideas are only the results of specific relationships of production, that they're a result of the class system. So most of these ideas, according to Marx, are those that serve the interests of the ruling class, of course, right? So they serve the bourgeoisie. According to Marx, all these ideas, these religions and things that we have, those are all something that is being perpetuated by the bourgeoisie, by the ruling class. They're being used to oppress the workers. So those things should also be done away with as part of this revolution. And that's one of the reasons why you see in communist societies, religion is tossed aside. They are atheistic societies, for the most part. All right, the next point. The ruling class makes the rules that form society and supports those ideas that help them meet their ends. So once again, that's the point that Marx is trying to make here. All right, so it's the bourgeoisie who glorify property rights because they own most of the property. So we have to do away with those things. We have to do away with all those things that are benefiting that ruling class. All right, Marx then gets into how he views this revolution as unfolding. So the workers become the rulers. They eliminate private property, eliminating all those vestiges of old class power. All right. So the next point here is that it kind of gets tough to understand if in the manifesto it's talking about history or if it's laying out specific plans. So how you see it is really up to you. That is not something that's really been determined. Is to what extent Marx is saying that all of this is the natural progression and how much of it is he's trying to lay out a plan, right? And that's really up to your own interpretation as to what Marx is saying here, because he does say that this really is a natural progression of history at points, but how much of it is actually natural? So how much of it is free will of the workers and how much of it is going to happen regardless? And Marx does say that the revolution is inevitable, but really what pace it's going to come at is something that's really undetermined, right? All right, the next point is that communism feels that history is an unchangeable force, but also it is leading to a morally desirable outcome, all right? So he is talking about a development of society here through that communist revolution. And what is the communist role in that process of history, all right? Because obviously at this point, and obviously throughout history, communism did not take over within the UK, all right? And it did take over in certain areas, but one thing that Marx probably wouldn't predict is that within the places where Marxism and communism did take hold, of course, in many cases, been overthrown as well. And perhaps some would argue that that's because those societies were never entirely Marxist. The Soviet Union, for instance, is a country that respected borders, right? We had spheres of influence. You had the Berlin Wall. Those are things that would not be embraced by Marx, because Marx is somebody who saw a world that was also borderless. Marx didn't believe in borders. He believed that everything was determined by class, and that the communist revolution should spread beyond any borders, that there were no borders for the revolution. It should be a global revolution, according to Marx. And that's one of the reasons why, during the Cold War, American Western policymakers saw such a danger in the spread of communism, because the ideology itself did not see any borders. It was something that was intended to be a global revolution. All right. All right, then the last question here is really, if that communist revolution is an inevitable force of history, as Marx is saying, why do we need the Communist Manifesto, right? If these things are going to happen anyway, why do we need this? And I would really say that it's about the pacing of it, that Marx is trying to spur this on faster than it would naturally take place. All right, just a few notes here about Marx and Engels and their writing style. One thing to note is that their techniques of responding to criticisms is often in a very harsh and sarcastic manner, remember, he's calling for a violent revolution here, right? So he doesn't really take very soft tones on how he addresses the opposition. And it's really up to you to consider whether or not this approach was effective. Obviously, within certain societies, it has been, as we've seen throughout history. But would it also be more convincing if he had a more serious tone about those critiques of communism? And this is really about the style of argumentation within the text. But then the last point here too is, could it also have this revolutionary sort of tone to it if it was changed, right? All right, now is a point where we really get into the differences between communism and socialism. It seems to me that a lot of people confuse those different terms, right? And that they entangle communism, socialism in with each other. Marx, within the Communist Manifesto, really draws major distinctions between the two. All right. What Marx says is that socialist ideas that have been put in place in various societies have failed because they missed out on the key component of communist theory. So what he's saying here is that really what socialists don't acknowledge enough is that inevitability of the bourgeoisie's rise and fall at the hands of the proletariat. So he draws out socialists into two different camps here, all right? So he has conservative socialists and critical utopian socialists. So the conservative socialists are ones that he argues do not see the obvious features of class antagonism and of the destruction of the bourgeoisie. All right, so they are people who really are very complacent and are fine with the status quo. They say the workers just need some additional things. They need, certain protections, for things like healthcare or paid leave or better working conditions, labor laws, those sorts of things. But otherwise, society is generally pretty good. We just have to make some tweaks to it, right? Marx completely dismisses that school of thought. The other camp that he points out here are critical utopian socialists. And he argues that there are people who do not understand that social change must occur in revolutions and not by words with dreamlike qualities. All right. So let's dive into this a little bit more. All right. So focusing on the conservative socialists here. So the conservative socialists are a group that Marx really abhors. And this is something that's often seen as how countries like the United States embrace the working class, right? So we have certain protections for the working class within society. We have things like welfare, social security, a minimum wage. And all those are things that Marx would completely dismiss of. All right, and that's where we get into the difference between socialism and communism, right? Because what Marx says is that these are simply things to protect and preserve the capitalist system by making the position of the proletariat more tolerable. All right, and he's saying that the proletariat would be better off if we just did away with these things and had a complete revolution. There's no placating those classes. All right, there's no placating the working class. That they're settling for too little if they take these little crumbs that the bourgeoisie is willing to give them. He argues that these reforms are really done in the interest of the bourgeoisie, of the upper classes, to appease the proletariat and make them accept that social role. All right, and that they'll never advance in this type of system. So this can be hard for many to swallow, but this is what Marx says, and that the reforms that have been put in place in places like the UK and the United States have never accomplished what was intended in terms of being able to advance those in the proletariat, in the working class. So this is what Marx is really getting into here, and he's throwing out all these ideas of things that people who would oftentimes be considered more to the left in a place like the United States, welfare, social security, minimum wage. He says we completely do away with it. Now, I don't really see, we have the presidential campaign starting up now. I don't hear any candidates arguing to completely get rid of welfare, social security, minimum wage, all those things, right? Those wouldn't be popular positions in the United States. But within a Marxist system, those things are completely done away with. All right. So, once again, Marx believes that this type of socialism is completely wrong. He feels that the only fix to the problems of the proletariat, of the working classes, is by restructuring the economic and social relations completely. So you need revolution. You need that revolutionary act. So the suggested reforms of conservative socialists are merely there to serve the elites. And really the type of, social democrats, the type of, socialism that we've seen within Western societies from Marx really is not enough. They're merely these aspects of conservative socialists, is what he would call them. All right. So he's saying that these sorts of reforms are really in the interest of the ruling capitalists, not the workers. All right. Whether you agree or disagree with that is completely up to you. Okay. Some last points here then about Marx. So he ends by showing what his political agenda has in store. All right. So if you look at the end of the Communist Manifesto, he's talking about what that utopian vision looks like. So the end goal of that proletariat revolution and the abolition of private property and class differences are all things that Marx sees as being better for mankind moving forward. He feels that history must go through these stages. So he's saying that this exploitation and things were necessary because they brought us to the point of that revolution. All right. All right. Some last points here then. So while communists have a strong foundation, let's see. All right. So the last point here is really talking about what does it take to accelerate that realization of that communist utopia. So once again, it's this point about whether or not these things are inevitable, they're the natural progression of things, and how much of it needs to be accelerated by the people themselves. All right, and that's really a lingering question with Marx that isn't really addressed completely within the text. All right, some final thoughts here then on Marx. So Marx does not simply declare that all workers shall one day unite, all right? And really, he's talking about this workers' revolution, but he never says exactly when that will happen, right? He never draws out exactly when that point will be. He just calls on workers to unite, promising them freedom and a better world free of class struggles. And it is pretty open-ended within the text. Remember, it's written in a simple way, so there is a lot that is still, not addressed within the text. It's really more of a call to action. All right, and he's trying to spur along this revolution a bit quicker than it would otherwise happen. All right, so that sort of wraps up the Communist Manifesto and the main ideals within that text. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat box. If not, I'm going to continue going. So we have the three other shorter readings. So the first one we have is the one from Leon Trotsky. So Trotsky is somebody who was one of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. Early on, he was somebody who eventually had a falling out with Joseph Stalin. So in 1929, Trotsky went into exile in Mexico, actually, and in 1940 he was murdered by one of Stalin's secret agents. So, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the various purges and things that happened within the Soviet Union. Trotsky is somebody who was killed in one of those purges, even though he was in exile. All right. So the text that we have here from Trotsky is called The Permanent Revolution. All right, and this is really building off of the Communist Manifesto and the things that Marx wrote about. All right, and how those things go into practice. Trotsky is somebody who was really a leader of communist thought within the Soviet Union and putting those ideas into practice within that society. I just want to focus on a few points here. So if you go to the text, what is the permanent revolution? If you go to point number 2, I'll just read off a few of these. So there's just a few that I want to address to sort of give you a taste of the meaning behind the text. So the second point here is, with regard to countries with a belated bourgeois development, especially the colonial and semi-colonial countries, the theory of the permanent revolution signifies that the complete and genuine solution of their tasks of achieving democracy and national emancipation is conceivable only through the dictatorship of the proletariat as the leader of the subjugated nation above all of its peasant masses. All right, so what he's arguing for here is for the peasants to be the ones to control society. Because when the peasants control society, you're going to have a classless society at that point. All right. It's simply a dissolution of the bourgeoisie, all right? So that everybody is within that proletariat class within society. Okay, point number 4 then. Go to point number 4, Trotsky writes, no matter what the first episodic stages of the revolution may be in the individual countries, the realization of the revolutionary alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry is conceivable only under the political leadership of the proletarian vanguard organized in the Communist Party. This in turn means that the victory of the democratic revolution is conceivable only through the dictatorship of the proletariat, which bases itself upon the alliance with the peasantry and solves first of all the tasks of the democratic revolution. And there seems to be some points of tension here, right? So they're talking about democratic revolution, but then they're also saying dictatorship of the proletariat, right? It becomes very difficult to reconcile those things. And if we look at communist history, if we look at how the society was ordered, it was not really purely Marxist, right? You didn't have a classless society because, of course, those who were in government positions oftentimes had advantages. So you really had political classes within society. There really has never been a truly classless society. Instead, things were ordered really more by loyalty to the state, right? And it was just a different type of class system really within the Soviet Union. So what Trotsky is calling for here is in order to have that classless society, you need the proletariat to take control. But what we saw throughout history and practice really is that we never really had that classless types of utopian society. All right, if you go to point number 8, then, Trotsky writes, the dictatorship of the proletariat, which has risen to power as a leader of the democratic revolution, is inevitably and very quickly confronted with tasks, the fulfillment of which is bound up with deep inroads into the rights of bourgeois property. The democratic revolution grows over directly into the socialist revolution and thereby becomes a permanent revolution. All right. So you see some terms here that seem to be contradictory with each other. I mean, when they talk about democratic dictatorship, right, that becomes very confusing. And one of the things that we've seen in practice is that within the Soviet Union, within communist states, that is something that is confusing. If you look at China now, China has a lot of contradictions as well, right? When you have the Communist Party in charge, but then you also have these special economic zones, which are more capitalist, there's a lot of messiness to actually putting these ideas into practice. So the pure type of theoretical revolution that Marx is writing about, that's never really happened within world history. It's been a lot messier in practice. Okay. All right, those are just a few passages I want to point out from Trotsky. Next, I'll move into the Mao Zedong reading, so which builds on some of the same terms. On the People's Democratic Dictatorship is the title of this text. Mao, of course, was the leader of China and the Chinese Communist Revolution. He led the Chinese Communist Party to taking over. His programs, the Great Leap Forward, are things that were put into practice. Of course, a lot of difficulties there as well. Tens of millions of people died during the Chinese Communist Revolution because of the upheavals in the economy, the massive famine. There are a lot of difficulties into putting these ideas into practice. And these were things that weren't really addressed so much in the Communist Manifesto, as we saw. All right, so if we go to Mao's reading on the People's Democratic Dictatorship, this is from 1949. All right, if we go just a few sentences into the text, Mao writes, when social classes are eliminated, the party and the state, as tools of the class struggle, will lose their function and the need for them. Thus, they will decline gradually and perish following the end of their historical mission, and then human society will enter a more advanced stage. We are in direct opposition of the parties of the bourgeoisie. They fear the demise of class, state power, and party, whereas we declare publicly that we strive hard to create the conditions facilitating the demise of all of these. The leadership of the Communist Party and the state power of the people's dictatorship are just such conditions. All right. So it's important to look at some of the language that's used here. So he's talking about the people's dictatorship, right? If we look at even the name of the country today, right? The People's Republic of China. There's a lot of contradictory terms here, right? When they're talking about the people's dictatorship, that's trying to make people become more accepting of the term dictatorship, right? That it's the proletariat who's taking over. It's really living into these sorts of ideas that Trotsky was talking about as well, right? With having the bourgeoisie, having that one class take over the political system. But what we've seen within China, within the Soviet Union, is that it has not been the case in practice. Those who are in politically advantaged positions tend to create their own class within society. So while they may have this idea of eliminating economic classes, political classes still tend to dominate within society. All right. All right, going to a couple other quotes here within the Mao readings. There's a later passage in the text where Mao writes, "You are dictators. Kind gentlemen, you are right. Yes, we are dictators. Every lesson we learn from the past several decades forces us to implement people's democratic dictatorship or people's democratic despotism. Whatever names it refers to the same regime that deprives the right of speech to the counter-revolutionaries and grants it only to the people." All right, that's a key quote here. All right, what Mao is saying that this dictatorship that defines our society, it is your dictatorship. It is the people's dictatorship, right? So it's actually the people who are in charge of this dictatorship. And what we are doing is we're shutting out those counter-revolutionary forces. We're shutting out the people who don't want this revolution. So when they talk about restrictions on freedom of speech, when they talk about restrictions on any sort of freedoms within communist society, they're saying that it's for the good of the revolution. Right? It's good for that collective. Because remember, Marx didn't focus on individuality. He didn't focus on individual rights. Right? He talked about the rights of the class. So it's the people who are in charge of this dictatorship. So by having people, what Mao and Trotsky and Marx and those would argue is that really these things are necessary for the good of the revolution. They're good. They're for the general good of society. All right. So by shutting out those counter-revolutionary forces, they are against the people, all right? To use a term that we've seen more recently, they are the enemy of the people, right? The counter-revolutionary forces. All right, there's another quote just a bit later on as well, where Mao writes, "You are not benevolent, quite so. We never implement a policy of benevolence upon counter-revolutionaries and their reactionary behavior. Benevolent policy is only for the people, not for counter-revolutionaries and their reactionary behavior." So a key thing here that we see is that Mao is basically having this differentiation between the people and counter-revolutionaries. So what he's saying is that counter-revolutionaries really are not people. They're not the people. So those who are going against the revolution, they are not the people in the society, in the state, all right? And that's really a dangerous thing that we're looking at here, because if we look at history, if we look at genocides, the key factor in those is dehumanization, right? If you look at the Holocaust, people were dehumanized. So by having mass exterminations, by having millions of people killed, it wasn't seen as much of a loss because they weren't people, right? And that's one of the dangers here when we look at Mao's writings, where he's writing this differentiation between people and counter-revolutionaries, and that those who oppose the revolution really are not people, and they shouldn't be treated as people. He's saying they should not have rights. They need to be shut down. They need to be punished, killed, and that's why we see the sort of violence that we see within these sorts of societies. All right, because if we look at China, you know, in the 1940s, 1950s, the time period where Mao was in charge, there were deaths of tens of millions of people. And that's one of the reasons for the justifications of this was this differentiation. And when these writers, people like Marx, people like Mao, when they're writing about that utopian society, all those things that you know are explained as temporary struggles are leading to something greater, to that utopia, right? So all these people that were killed through the economic reforms, the agricultural reforms of communist societies, that was all leading towards something better, according to these leaders. Okay. All right. One last quote then from the Mao reading that I'll get to. Mao writes in the last paragraph of the text, "At the beginning, some Soviet communist members did not know how to develop their economy, and imperialists also waited for their failure. However, the Soviet Communist Party finally achieved victory. Under the leadership of Lenin and Stalin, they not only knew how to make a revolution, but also how to engage in construction. They have built a great and shining socialist country. All right. So he's saying that there were those temporary struggles within the Soviet Union, but it led to something great. It led to something amazing. All right. Now, looking at it from 2019, we probably wouldn't look at it as being as amazing anymore. But that was how these sorts of things were justified, by saying that these temporary struggles, the problems with constructing a new agricultural system, a new economic system, sure, they led to some temporary struggles for people, but it will lead to something great. All right. And that's really what was being promised at the time, and that's why so many bought into this particular system. All right. So the last one that I want to get to then is the Bernie Sanders reading, which is titled On Democratic Socialism in the United States. So Bernie Sanders, I'm sure you're all familiar with, running for president currently, ran for president last time. He calls himself a democratic socialist, right? Socialist being a different term from communism, as we've seen within the Communist Manifesto, right? So the things that Bernie Sanders is proposing with a higher minimum wage, expanding Social Security, these sorts of things are things that would not be liked very much by somebody like Marx, right? But Bernie Sanders, he does call himself a democratic socialist, so I think it was worth fitting in for the readings today. So of course it's a little bit different from the other readers or the other authors who we read today. People like Mao, who's calling for a democratic dictatorship and such. But I think it's good to look at how somebody like Sanders defines the term socialist in today's world as well. So again, relating some of these ideas to today. All right, so the speech that we have here is from Bernie Sanders. He was, in his speech, which is titled On Democratic Socialism in the United States, he is referring back to Franklin Roosevelt for much of the speech. Because Roosevelt had a number of programs which are often considered, things that you would see within a democratic socialist country, things like Social Security. All right, and Sanders is somebody who looks back very fondly on those ideas and those programs. So I just want to read a few passages here from the Sanders speech. So if you go just a little bit down in the text, just a few lines down. So the first thing that Sanders does is he writes about the time period where people are being denied basic necessities and the Great Depression. And then he starts writing about FDR. And he writes about FDR, and he acted against the ferocious opposition of the ruling class of his day, people he called economic royalists. Roosevelt implemented a series of programs that put millions of people back to work, took them out of poverty, and restored their faith in government. He redefined the relationship of the federal government to the people of our country. He combated cynicism, fear, and despair. He reinvigorated democracy. He transformed the country, and that is what we have to do today. All right, so that's what Sanders is calling upon, having that sort of FDR New Deal type revolution. He's not calling for a complete overthrow of the state like people like Marx and Mao, but he's saying that we need to have an expansion of these socialist programs. Okay, then the next paragraph, Sanders writes, and by the way, almost everything he proposed was called socialist. Social Security, which transformed life for the elderly in this country, was socialist. The concept of the minimum wage was seen as a radical intrusion into the marketplace and was described as socialist. Unemployment insurance, abolishing child labor, the 40-hour work week, collective bargaining, strong banking regulations, deposit insurance, and job programs that put millions of people to work were all described in one way or another as socialist. Yet these programs have become the fabric of our nation and the foundation of the middle class. All right, so that's where Sanders is really getting his inspiration from and his ideology. It's from these programs, people like Franklin Roosevelt who put them into place. And of course, what Sanders is calling for is an expansion of those types of programs. All right. If we go just a few paragraphs later, Sanders then writes, today in America, we are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, but few Americans know that because so much of the new income and wealth goes to the people at the top. In fact, over the last 30 years, there has been a massive transfer of wealth, trillions of wealth, going from the middle class to the top 0.1%, a handful of people who have seen a doubling of the percentage of the wealth they own over that period. All right. So that is what Sanders is pointing to as the problems of today. He looks at it many of the same ways as having that ruling class and the worker class, right? He's not calling for a violent revolution, but he is proposing those, what even he would term as socialist solutions, right? So having job programs, having an expansion of things like Social Security. Those are the things that Sanders is calling for in today's age. And really, Marx's ideology is something that would not really be palatable within American society, but this is about as far as people seem to be willing to go, is this sort of route. All right, if we go a little bit later in the text, these are things that Sanders says on the debate stage in his speeches regularly. Another quote that we have here is, "It means that healthcare should be a right of all people, not a privilege. This is not a radical idea. It exists in every other major country on earth, not just Denmark, Sweden, or Finland. It exists in Canada, France, Germany, and Taiwan. That is why I believe in Medicare for all, single-payer healthcare system. Yes, the Affordable Care Act, which I helped write and voted for, is a step forward for this country, but we must build on it and go further." All right? And that's one thing that we've seen just, last week. We had the Democratic debates, right? You had candidates calling for this Medicare for all type system, an expansion of those sorts of programs, which many would call socialist, right? And how you want to take those words, how you want to take those labels, and what they mean is up to you. All right, those are things that are still debatable as to what makes somebody a socialist, what makes somebody a Marxist, right? But it's important to point out what those terms are oftentimes interpreted as. And within the Sanders text, we can see, as you go through this, take note of the sort of things that he's writing and how those compare to the things that Marx was saying. Marx is somebody who would be extremely opposed to Sanders' ideas, interestingly enough, because he would argue they don't go far enough. All right. So hopefully today you have a little bit better understanding of Marxism, socialism, what those terms mean, and how they apply within these various time periods. So we looked at a number of different time periods. I mean, we looked at texts talking about communism, socialism over a period of about 150 years, all the way from Marx up to Bernie Sanders. All right. So hopefully you have a better understanding of those. Be sure to comment on the various texts within the discussion board for this week. All right. I think it focuses primarily on the Communist Manifesto reading, but you can, of course, bring the others in as well if you think they're important points for comparison. So remember, have the discussion boards in Saturday by midnight for the first one, and then your classmate response by Monday at midnight. All right, I'll try to get the week 2 discussion boards graded as soon as possible. All right, if you have additional questions, you can type them in the chat box now, or you can email me after the fact. But with that, we'll close it up, and I hope you all have a great holiday, and I'll see you all next week.